um your military service.
Oh, I mean when I was drafted and stuff like that?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay, okay. So we got to go way back over 50 years to 1968. I was in college for 2 years, and in those days, everybody was being drafted. They get a draft number, so you know when your draft number comes up, you're going to be drafted. And so they did have a plan where my birthday was June 13th. Um, and I went ahead and volunteered for the draft, which gave me a 90-day period where I could, get myself in order, and I took a trip to Hawaii and all that, and then I came back and I was drafted in September of 1968. And in those days, they were drafting about 50 to 55,000 young men a month to go to the war, because in 1968 through 1970, that was the height of the war with Tet Offensive, and we all knew that we were going to be going into infantry, unless you extended to a 4-year stay. So I went up to Fort Lewis, Washington, for my boot camp, and then they immediately turned us into our infantry training, and then I was shipped over to Vietnam in December, early December of 1968. So we went from 3 feet of snow in Washington to 105 degrees, and I got off that plane and I thought, oh my God, I can't live here. It just smelled like a cesspool. It was just awful. The humidity was terrible. Um, and then they gave us a 4-day training. We didn't even have a rifle for 4 days while we were there. And there was, gunfire and grenades and all that stuff around Long Binh. And we couldn't even sleep at night because we were petrified that we would get attacked, and then we had no defense. But during that time, the 82nd Airborne was up north, and in the beginning of the Tet Offensive, they had a lot of casualties, and included in those casualties were medics. And so they had a very shortage of medics, so they asked for volunteers to be part of a program on the job training to become a medic in a war zone. And I did volunteer, so they chose 8 of us, and I was shipped to Third Field Hospital, where we underwent 6 to 8 weeks of on-the-job training, where we learned how to suture, we learned how to debride wounds, we learned how to give injections, we knew how to assess a situation. So it was really right there in the war. So within about 2 weeks of classroom training intensive, where we practiced injecting each other and all that, they threw us into the triage area where the wounded would be flown into Saigon, and they were major injuries. So our job was to stabilize the patients when they came in, because they were going to be shipped to Germany for further treatment if they couldn't do it in Third Field. And so I did that for, I think it was like 6 or 8 weeks. And then I flew back to my 82nd Airborne base camp in Phu Loy, where I remained there for 18 months. So that was at the same time they were spraying Agent Orange. And we were right in the Mekong Delta. And we would get a lot of patients that came in from the field that were actually sprayed with Agent Orange. And that's where, I got my exposure to the herbicides. And that's what has been affecting me for the last 50 years. Is that good?
That's really good actually.
Shall I continue?
Sure.
Okay, so during that time, we were like a MASH unit. If you're familiar with that, it's all tents, and so our surgery rooms, our debriding rooms, and our triage area were in a big tent where we could treat probably up to 8 or 10 injured soldiers at a time. They would fly in on a helicopter. And we worked 16 to 18 hours a day. When we were sleeping, if there were gunfire, we went to the bunker, and so we survived on, I'd say 4 to 5 hours of sleep max, because of the casualties during that time of the war. It was, to me, very traumatic, because within the first 45 days that I was in our boot camp, I put death tags on about 8 or 10 of my buddies that I trained with in Fort Lewis. That, of course, they were infantry attached to 82nd Airborne, and I became the medic in the back. So that was really a terrible experience. And I was only 20 years old when I got drafted, and I turned 21 in Vietnam. I spent 2 Christmases in Vietnam. And part of the unique story on my side was why I was there for 18 months. In those days, they didn't want two brothers in the war zone at the same time. And I had my younger brother who was in the Marines touring the Mediterranean. And so I figured out that if I extended my stay for 6 months, that would only leave him 11 months left, and then they would not send him to Vietnam for a 12-month tour. But the trade-off with that generosity on my part to my brother was the fact that that was the height of the Tet Offensive, and it was the worst part of my stay there. And the other part was that after 12 months, my whole group that I came with from Fort Lewis all went home because their tour was over, and then I didn't really have a support base or support group the last 6 months I was there, and that was really very, very hard for me. The other thing that we did was very unique. We did what they call a med cap. And so what was happening around our area within, say, 25 miles with these small villages, I guess the military thought that we were injuring civilians in those villages. And so they had a program where we would go out on a Saturday. And so there were like 4 Jeeps. We had the ARVNs, which is the Vietnamese army. And then there were 2 Jeeps with a doctor and 2 medics and maybe 4 of us, I guess. And we would go out to these villages and treat their wounds, which were gunshot wounds and things like that. And then we would come back to our base. But that same night, we would get gunfire from that village. So after about, I think I did this for 3 or 4 weekends, they suspended it because we figured out that we were actually treating the Viet Cong, and the Viet Cong was in that village, and they told those people, you pretend that I'm your husband or we're going to kill you. And so what happened, we went out there and we were actually treating the enemy and didn't know it. So they suspended that program. And as I look back on that risk that we all took and the dedication that we had to help civilians and do our job, was a big, big mistake. And also it was very, I don't know, it was just sad, I think. And to me, I'm haunted all the time with, flashbacks and things like that, that I got in the war with those particular issues. And we tried to do a good thing, and evidently, it kind of backfired. But at least I put myself out there, and I'm very proud that I did that. I was a very mature guy at my age. I come from a family of 13, and so I was very mature, and thank God I was, because I avoided a lot of other side effects and issues that the men had in Vietnam.
Okay. One thing I don't think we mentioned real quick. What is your name for the recording?
Oh, my name is David Carden Jr., but my legal name is Lloyd David Carden, and I live here in Palm Springs.
That's great. What equipment did you have on you during the height of the Tet Offensive?
Well, we always had, the odd thing was, we're in the Vietnam is very humid. You have torrential rains and things like that. So we had our boots, were green boots, but they weren't solid leathers because we were walking around in the mud and everything like that all the time. We had our M16 rifles. We had, I guess, just jackets and things like that. We were really ill-equipped. We didn't have safety vests. We didn't have masks for gas masks and all that. We kind of stripped down. In Vietnam, it was kind of bare bones, really. And that, it's not like today when you see the troops over there in Afghanistan, where they are fully equipped. In Vietnam, we were not. It was just a bunch of infantry guys out there trying to fight a war, and didn't really have a lot of support in terms of gear that we wore. It was just, like I said, we had an M16 rifle. We had to patrol our perimeter. We rotated those shifts at night. And then we just worked our butts off all day long, when casualties came in. And that was a steady stream. So that's pretty much it. We slept in tents.
All right. I'm sorry to hear that, but before the war, what was your opinion on the Vietnam War?
Well, I lived in San Francisco, and that was the summer of love in 1968. So there was a lot of war protests. And I didn't support the war, but I also felt that if I was drafted, I would serve. I never had a second thought of not serving, and I was up to the challenge.
That's good to hear. So, where were you during the Tet Offensive?
Well, Phu Loy is about 45 to 50 miles, I guess it would be east of Saigon, and not too far from we were like 30 miles from the Long Binh, which is the main hub for activity. So we were in the Mekong Delta, out in I guess there's like big rivers that run through there, and what was happening was the Viet Cong was coming from the north, and they wanted to come in and overtake Saigon, and we were right there in the middle of the Mekong Delta where all of the action was happening, and the herbicides that they sprayed for Agent Orange was to kill the brush in those delta areas so then we could see the enemy. Otherwise, they were walking in water around the tules and things like that, and we couldn't see them. And so that's why they did the Agent Orange. So we were right in the middle of that action, along with the 101st Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne, the 3rd Brigade. I mean, there was just all the action was in that area there to keep them from coming into Saigon and Long Binh.
How much active combat did you see?
I saw a lot every day. I mean, I didn't participate in it. I mean, I did as a medic. I was not out there in the front line. I was right behind them. So we actually had gunfire in our bunkers and had to protect ourselves during that timeline. And so I wasn't out there walking in the Delta, but I was right there behind them in the same area.
How organized do you reckon the opposing forces were?
Well, they were pretty determined. I mean, the Viet Cong, as you know, with the war, they had a lot of casualties. And what they would do is they would infiltrate into these villages and pretend like they were from that village, but they really weren't. And almost all the firing and the gunfire was done at night so they can sneak around. And that's why there were choppers that would fly around with big beam lights so they could see the movement of the Viet Cong, and then they would shoot artillery into our area pretty much every night. And we had our M16s, when we shot them, there were tracers. They were either red or green, and so we could shoot maybe, I don't know, 25 bullets at a time, but we knew where the bullets were going. That's because of the tracers, and we also knew where the fire was coming from, the Viet Cong coming into us, and how close they were. So they were well organized and very determined.
In a lot of movies based around the Vietnam time, there's a lot of traps around Vietnam. Is that the case, or do you not know?
There's a lot of what?
A lot of traps.
Trash.
Traps.
Traps. Oh, you mean? Oh, yeah. Oh, right. And that's another thing. When we would go out to on the med caps to those villages, there were little kids. They somehow we always had chiclets, and that's little candies, I guess. And so we had lots of that we got from the military. And so when we went out anywhere, we would give the little kids chiclets. And so they would stand alongside the road, wanting chiclets and want us to stop. Well, one time we did that, and the Jeep in front of me, when they left, hit a landmine and killed 4 of my buddies. And so after that, we did not venture off of the regular road, and we did no longer stop to talk, because the little kids were actually planting the bombs. I mean, the traps. So they would dig a hole, and then they would stand nearby, get the chickens, and they would run away. And then when the Jeep left, they would get blown up. So it was a faceless enemy. And that was the other thing. The Viet Cong, I mean, all the Vietnamese people, they looked alike. And so you really couldn't tell who they were. But they would get those little kids to do the landmines all along the road and trying to get the American soldiers to pull off. Or if they had to pull off for some reason, they were subjected to explosions.
That's crazy. Wow. So I was reading a few articles about Agent Orange at the time. So during the Vietnam War, did no one really know the dangers of Agent Orange to humans?
No, actually, the sad part is, the troops didn't even know they were spraying Agent Orange. Um, we never had a lot of communication. We didn't have televisions, obviously. We had radios that we could play music, but we got no information from America, the mainland. But what was happening during my time is that they were underreporting the numbers of deaths. And if you look back during all this time I was there, the last 8 months going into 1969, they would report maybe 20 Americans that were killed. But that particular day, I might have put death tags on 15 people. And I know that they were from other deaths around Vietnam. So they were lying to the American people about what they were doing. And Monsanto had storage areas for Agent Orange in Guam. So they came from Guam over to Vietnam, and they were spraying the fields. What happened to us, we all of a sudden were getting the troops, the infantry troops, they would come with us, and they were all sprayed with some orange spray. And what it does, Agent Orange attacks your nervous system. So what happened is they immediately go into some toxic shock. So we would take their clothes off and their bodies would swell because it's 102 degrees and everything would close down. So what we did, I'm going to be very, very honest and graphic about it. When they would come in sprayed, if you imagine like a pumpkin with two little dots for the eyes and a little bump for the nose, that was their face because their bodies were exploding. So the doctors told us we shot them with massive doses of morphine. They were in a lot of pain, but some of them that were just unconscious, and we slit their skin with razor blades because the body would have exploded, and they died. So within half an hour to 45 minutes, they were dead. And that happened a lot. That's when we knew something was going on. We didn't realize it was the Americans spraying. We thought maybe it was the Viet Cong. But they did a lot of that over, I would say, I don't know how long they'd sprayed, but they did a lot of it. And we were totally unaware of it, but we did see the immediate toxic shock with the guys. It was a terrible way to die.
When did they find out that Agent Orange was harmful to humans?
I think they knew ahead of time that, because that's why they were using it. Really, they thought they could just spray the Mekong Delta and kill the Viet Cong, but that wasn't what had happened because we had all the exposure through water. I mean, if they sprayed it the river and they were out there tramping around in the river, you were exposed to Agent Orange. And like I said, it attacks your nervous system, neurological issues. And so in my case, I'm now 100% disabled. I have what happened was my toes my nerves started to die in my toes and my feet. So I was tripping and falling all the time with drop foot. And when I go to the VA over the last, say, 6 or 7 years that I've been involved with it, they refuse to talk about Agent Orange. I think the American military has always downplayed the effects of Agent Orange and never took responsibility to the Vietnam veterans. And here's an interesting statistic. 2.5 million men served in Vietnam over that period of time, maybe 10 years. 1.5 million are already dead. So there's 1 million of us left, maybe less than 1 million of us left from Vietnam. And they are finally, just in the last month for me anyway, put in writing that I suffer from, it's combat related, Vietnam era, herbicide exposure. My condition is static, which means I'm not going to ever get better. There's no cure for the damage that I'm experiencing from Agent Orange. I wear prosthetic braces on both legs, and then I now have knee braces. So from my thigh down, I have prosthetics to be able to walk without falling. I use a 4-wheel rollator and I use a cane 24 hours a day. The the blessing I think that I find with myself, with my Agent Orange issues, is that it's painless. If you talk to anybody that has diabetes and neuropathy, they have this intense pain in their feet and their legs. I don't have that. What I have is tingling, and I have loss of nerves. So I can't feel my feet. I can't feel my calves or my legs. If I got cut, I wouldn't know it. So it's a unique situation. And so the VA, over the period of the last 2 years, in fact, the last 5 months, I have had extensive testing outside the VA with private doctors on nerve testing, and they determined that I've got this extensive damage, but they don't really understand why, in my case, with the neuropathy with no pain, but extensive damage. But now I think there's something happening in the VA administration now that they are opening up for treatment and willing to discuss the effects of Agent Orange and the neurological damage that we have all experienced and no cure.
So, when you returned to the United States, was your return as welcoming as you expected?
No, I was so disappointed. And those, I went right back into, I had maybe 6 months, I went back to college. But I remember my last 6 months, I was stationed at Presidio in San Francisco. And I lived in Northern California in Clear Lake. And so every 4th of July, they had a big parade down the street and stuff. So 5 of us buddies drove up, stayed with my mom and dad, and we were celebrating 4th of July at the parade. And in those days, you could use firecrackers, right? So they were throwing firecrackers, and when the firecrackers went off, all 5 of us hit the ground. And we were in shorts because in July it's like 100 degrees up there. And our knees were scraped and bloodied. And then they kept doing it. And they would walk over to us and spit at us and say that, we were Vietnam vets and we're commies and all that. I mean, it was just a terrible, terrible thing. So we were kind of branded in a way that we fought for our country, and yet we came home to a war that America loved to hate. And America did hate that war, and we were thrown under the bus. And so even though a lot of guys got deferments because they were chicken, they didn't want to go to defend us. Some of them fled to Canada. That always ticked me off. And then they had the nerve to spit at us. And that's why I think it was so difficult for the Vietnam veterans to go into the VA system to seek help, because they weren't welcoming either. It was a war that America lost. And so we were collateral damage at a very young age. And I think that has always been the case. And maybe there's been a reckoning now with American conscience with the Vietnam War and how devastating it was to the young guys. But in my era, in 1968 through 1970, the war was really still on the minds of a lot of people, a lot of protests, and they hated us. And I just felt so abandoned, I think it was. I just felt like, my 18 months of blood and guts and all the things I went through meant nothing to a lot of people. And that has always haunted me. And that flashback I have of these young people and grown men throwing firecrackers just to see us fall down on the ground and then laugh at us was just despicable.
Can you think of a few reasons why this happened?
Well, I think that, there was a lot of protests against the war and a lot of lies from the American government about the war and the purpose of the war. And in those days, the young kids were very militant and they were very angry to try to get us out of that war. And then, of course, it didn't happen. So I think the mindset across college campuses in those days were the fact that we didn't win the war, we lost the war, and now they wanted to get beyond it and also hold the government accountable. So it's a kind of a mixed bag of their purposes. I did go finish college. I was in the student senate in Sacramento, the college, Sacramento State. I was very active in that. But I could never be a proud Vietnam veteran in those days because they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to accept us back. And they just had a lot of anger.
How do you feel the Army has changed your life?
Oh my God. At 20 years old and coming from a family of 13 kids, and I'm the first one to graduate from college out of my generation and my family. The Army did provide me with the GI Bill to go to college and stuff. Like I said, I turned 21 there, so I grew up really very, very quickly. It robbed me of my youth, I think. The war, in my case, with the experiences that I had, when I came back at 21 and 22 years old, I missed music. I missed a lot of things during that time that you could never get back. And I told myself when Vietnam, and you never had a guarantee that you would live till the next day. So you kind of make amends with yourself. And so I told myself if I came back alive and I would do these things, I would not lie, cheat, or steal. And I would go to bed with no regrets, which means that I have an issue with somebody, I solve it right there. I don't gunny sack anything. And I just live a very honest life. And a lot of people can't handle honesty like that. But that's the only way that I could, in my mind, when I came back home, it has to work for me. I have to do something that I earn my day. I go to bed with no regrets. And I don't hold grudges. I mean, I do think that the Army, or I mean, the VA now is finally coming to grips with things that are happening with a lot of Vietnam veterans. But it affected my life in a way that I missed my youth, and I have always kind of regretted that. But by the same token, it made me more determined to chart my own course in life and be successful, and I've done that, and I've done it very well, I think. I hide a lot of things. I mean, I am on medication for flashbacks and things like that, and now I have mobility issues. When people look at me, they think, "Oh my God, you're very healthy." But you know what? I take about 10 different medications a day to keep me going, and I have maybe 4 or 5 hours during the day that I'm kind of on top of everything. Other than that, I have a lot of pain. I have to lay down and all that. I'm limited in what I can do. So I think it's shaped me into a person that, I live for the moment and I enjoy moments. And so if there's a nice sunset, I go out and I watch that sunset, or I'll get up early and I watch a sunrise. I stop and watch birds. I stop and watch the shadows of the mountains as they change. And because, you don't have a you don't have a guarantee that you won't get hit by a car and die or whatever. That's always been a thing of mine. So, like I said, I live a good quality of life. I've made it work for me, and I'm a good person. I'm an honest person, and um, I just accept every challenge that I have, and I try to turn it into a positive.
That's good to hear. What were your thoughts about the presidents during the Vietnam War?
Well, Nixon was under an awful lot of pressure during the war, and I served under General Westmoreland in Vietnam. I think there was a balancing act, I think, of, okay, we got into this war, now how do we get out of it? At the same time, you're losing thousands of lives a month, which I never liked. However, at the end of the day, the 82nd Airborne is always in any conflict that we have in America. The 82nd Airborne are the first units to go in, and they're the first ones to allow to go out. And I experienced that when Nixon said, "Okay, we're withdrawing our troops from Vietnam," and we had 2 hours to pack our stuff, and it said, "You're going home." We're going, really? I mean, we couldn't believe it. And so the government does. I mean, the military follows that rule, which I think was kind of cool. I mean, we were the first ones to go home, and I'll never forget landing in Oakland and just kissing the ground. And that flight from Vietnam, we stopped in Japan, then we stopped in Alaska, and then went to Oakland, because in those days the planes didn't have enough fuel, but it was like the longest trip home ever. And so I think for me, the president was under an awful lot of pressure. He did start the process to get us out, and I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that I was able to survive, my experiences.
What did you do after you left the army?
Well, I came back in September, so I had to wait until the first of the year to start school. So I went back to college. So I had done 2 years of college. Now I went back to college in Sacramento State, majoring in business. So I took advantage of the GI Bill to get my education. And so I went to college I got my 4-year degree. I majored in business, and I had a minor in Japanese. And then in 1974, when I graduated, I had 1 year of graduate school. I was hired by a big, large wholesale firm, and I worked for them for 6 or 8 years. And then in 1981, I bought my first house on the GI Bill too, which was nice. I bought 2 houses actually using my GI rights or the housing, and then became a realtor in 1981, and I'm a realtor today. So it gave me the opportunity to get my education, and I'm grateful for that.
That's awesome. I'm gonna be honest. How old are you right now?
I'm 72.
Wow. Have you seen how the army looks today? And if so, how does it compare to how it did in the 70s?
Oh my God. There's literally no comparison. I think they're more trained. They have all of the supplies, things like that, to keep them safe. I think their accommodations now are more obviously they have made big strides, and they don't have tent cities like we did. I'm sure in Afghanistan. So all of that has changed. I mean, there's a lot more money now that's spent in the military than there was in my era in Vietnam. Of course, in Vietnam, we had so many challenges in that country. It's just amazing, to look at Vietnam today and how it's recovered, I guess. I mean, I have no desire to go to Vietnam myself. But the Army today, I think, is much more, I think they have, like I say, a lot more training. They have a lot more back up the armor, all the outfits and the uniforms that they wear in combat are totally different than what we had. We had little floppy hats and thin shirts because we were wet all the time. So it's a different era. But I'd say that they've spent a lot more money, I think, in support of maybe helping the troops nowadays when they go to war. They have a lot more equipment and things like that that we never had.
hmm One thing my history teacher always tells us, like every single class, don't believe everything you hear on the news. What's your thought on that?
I agree 100%, because in my era in Vietnam, like I said, they were downplaying the number of deaths, and they did that knowingly. They did that to the American people to kind of calm down the protests and things about, oh, we're winning the war, but we were never winning the war. And I think I don't know what the thinking was in terms of the president and administration, and the military went along with that, but they've always skewed information. And I still today, if you're looking at facts and things out of Afghanistan or Iraq, um, I I would not believe all of that myself. I think that when those veterans come back, they tell a different story, just like I tell a different story.
hmm How do you feel about movies and TV shows depicting the Vietnam War and stuff you've actually been through?
Okay, I've spent 51 years not watching them. I did not, when I came back in 1970, I didn't have a television for 10 years. Because the war was not over, really. They were still fighting. And all the news would show combat, men in active combat, getting shot and explosions and all that. And that caused immediate flashbacks. And so I avoided any of those movies. I've never seen that movie Private Ryan or anything. If there's something on the television that's coming up on a war update, even today, I leave the room. So I have not watched movies. I don't watch television shows that have military actions, because things just trigger flashbacks for me, and then I cry for 15, 20 minutes, maybe half an hour, uncontrollably, and then at the time I'm doing that, my mind is reliving what I went through. So I have spent a lifetime avoiding all of that. I do have a therapy session with my PTSD that I have with the VA to walk me through. I take medication to keep my anxiety level um, low, and I also take heavy sleeping medication so I can sleep at night without having the nightmares and flashbacks, and that has been with me for 52 years. So I'm balancing all of that now with medication, but I still have bouts of um, flashbacks.
What are your thoughts on the current United States military?
Oh boy, it's hard to say. You know, America wants to always be dominant in every area they want to go into. And I think that we've made big mistakes, I think, in Afghanistan and Iraq, where you're fighting, alongside countries that have fought now for 1,000 years, and they're never going to get along. The Palestinians are not going to get along with the Indians. And so, I mean, you have all these different cultures and histories in those countries, and America really has no right meddling in those areas, I think, and putting our men and women in harm's way. For what? You're not going to change that culture. They're going to have to go through their own um, calamities that they have. And I don't think that America has any right to go in and try to fix everything. And you're not going to change their minds. I mean, that's the other thing. I don't understand why America wants to get involved in these military conflicts where it's not going to benefit us at all, and it just costs more human sacrifice.
That's about all the questions I have for you today. Is there anything you want to say before the interview ends?
Well, I really want to thank you for taking the opportunity to share my story. I think for me, it's been a journey that's not complete yet. I have more challenges, but I think the more that America understands the Vietnam era and the Vietnam veterans is a positive, because we should not be forgotten. And we played a big part in maintaining our democracy. And I'm so thankful that you are taking the time to do that. So I appreciate the project.
Thank you. Heidi was right. You do have a lot to say.
Well, did I do it okay?
You did great.
Okay. Well, listen, I commend you and thank you and good luck on your project. And let me know when it's done so I can take a peek at it, maybe online someday.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, Trey. Have a good day.
You too.
All right. Ciao. Bye.